Hello everyone, I'm Joe Knapp, and today I'm going to be introducing our reading from Dr. Archie Dick on the Cape Flats Township Libraries and the roles that they played during the growing movement to end apartheid in South Africa during the 1980s. Before we get into the article itself, it's important to familiarize ourselves with the context in which the libraries that Dr. Archie Dick is writing about existed. And while the article does provide some context, a broader understanding of apartheid in South Africa can only help in allowing for a more complete reading. Starting in 1948 with the election of the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, apartheid was the creation of a system of laws on a national level that backed up and increased segregation stances that had previously been dominant. Under apartheid, Black, Indian, and Asian, as well as mixed-race or colored people found themselves forcibly moved to conform to a strict separation of the races, as well as having civil liberties stripped away based on which racial group they were identified as being a part of. I would recommend taking some time to visit the linked website, South African History Online, for more information about the specific laws passed, as well as more information on apartheid as a whole. Apartheid was not repealed until 1994, so in our lifetimes, with the election of Nelson Mandela as the president of South Africa, who had been in negotiations with the ruling Nationalist Party for years after being a political prisoner, who was ultimately released when the ruling party feared a civil war. Dick writes that the role libraries play in social change is still contested, with some arguing that they have less agency and are simply following along with the trends of the times, while others take the stance that libraries, but really the librarians and support staff within, are active agents of social change. In hoping to provide some historically backed evidence to this debate, Dick takes a look at libraries in the Cape Flats area of South Africa during the 1980s, a time of tremendous social upheaval as the end of apartheid was coming through social activism and resistance from the people. By looking at such a clear example of social change and studying how libraries operated therein, Dick aims to introduce more concrete evidence into the role that libraries and their people can and have played in social change. To begin this study in the role of libraries in social change, Dick takes some time setting up the context within which the libraries we'll be reading about existed. Dick reminds us that library involvement in social change is more than just structural or conspiratorial action, as most studies focus on, but also the reaction of township residents to social change and the banding together against social and material struggles. Citing an overwhelming view of public libraries, especially in the 1980s, as being inadequate and passive to the public's needs, Dick begins to break this down as a misconception, instead painting a picture of those public libraries as contested social space, which required careful navigation by the library staff. Cape Flats is introduced as being of particular importance due to the incredibly low literacy rates in the township, making the use of the space out of necessity more heavily focused on the oral debate traditions in the area, with the books inside the building serving mainly as props, setting the stage for an act of what the state would consider a library to be. Dick challenges the conception of space as simply the geography within which a library exists, pointing instead to a complex and constantly shifting social web being made and unmade by many different groups all at once. Taking the broader argument made about the construction of libraries as a social space from the previous section, here Dick brings specific context to what that space looked like in Cape Flats in the 1980s. Dick immediately establishes the conflict between the library as a public space needing to contend and contest with young political activists using the space, and as a public institution having to answer to the state with which those activists are trying to change. Not all libraries worked with activists, but every library found itself as a site of contention due to the cultural traditions that Dick outlined in the previous section. Libraries quickly found themselves at the center of things, being a common meeting space for youth and activists, which drove state interest, but also very commonly libraries would be placed inside of gang territory due to municipal planners not taking community leaders' input into consideration. Libraries in Cape Flats in the 1980s found themselves more or less at the center of the various destabilizing forces at work in the country, and many of the most affected had the fewest resources at their disposal, as allocations of both funds and space were race sensitive. One of 3 libraries in Mitchell's Plain in the 1980s, the Lentegure Public Library is the first of the libraries that Dick uses for his study. Built in what had previously been shrub-covered dunes, the Mitchell's Plain area suffered from a lack of resources under the apartheid system. Nevertheless, the former librarian, Reverend Clarence Shimmy, said that they used what resources they had to reach out to the community, and as such were able to grow their membership by a little over 7,000 people in the 1980s. This use of resources for community outreach manifested in programs like the Maryland Retreat Center Adult Literacy Program, which helped adult Mitchell's Plain residents learn to read and write, and the District 6 Memories Exhibition, where library staff and community members collected memorabilia from those displaced by the Group Areas Act and put on an art exhibition featuring them. In investing resources in their community, the library became embedded and as such faced little violence from gangs, activists, or the police. The library became a trusted space where people could escape from extreme township violence. Like the Lentegure Public Library, the Hanover Park Public Library and the Hanover Park Township were built as an area to move non-white persons displaced by the Group Areas Act. Unlike Mitchell's Plain, however, Hanover Park remained largely undeveloped, flat and sandy brushland, with open, unhygienic public spaces. Also unlike Lentegure, over the course of the 1980s, Hanover Park saw its library membership drop from 15,946 to 5,418 members. John Jacobs, the librarian at Hanover Park during this era, serves in Dick's case study as a more prominent example of conspiratorial action on the part of the library staff in enacting social change. Jacobs, sympathetic to the Socialist Cape Action League, engaged in various activities to support youth activism, from smuggling in banned books to distribute to allowing youth movement cells to use the library as a meeting space under the guise of more innocuous clubs. The continued promotion of the library as a space for meeting, discussion, and debate in the face of increased police presence and surveillance, Jacobs exhibited, as Dick puts it, commitment to the early Cape Library tradition. The Bontehuel Township was traditionally a farming area and is characterized by Dick as being a site of historical environmental degradation. Like the Hanover Park Public Library, Bontehuel saw a steep decline in membership over the 1980s, dropping from 21,531 members to 6,206. Degradation in membership can likely be attributed to the use of violence by the state against the library and its patrons over the course of that decade. In this climate, we're introduced to librarian Vincent Colby, who Dick identifies as being the strongest example of the Cape Library tradition, wherein the books within the library are incidental, and its space is more strongly tied to being a marketplace for the verbal exchange of ideas. Like Jacobs, Colby helped patrons get access to banned books that informed revolutionary movement and aided activists with space and materials. And like Shimi, Colby put a strong emphasis on building community and keeping the library connected to the people around it, many of whom were displaced former residents of District 6. Colby took active stands against state violence, banning police from the library when he learned of their plans to use it as a site of violence against the community. Combining the approaches of Jacobs and Shimi, Colby created a public space that was contested, but simultaneously not only shared, but served to unify the community as well. Archie Dick set out to use the Cape Flats Public Libraries as a case study to provide evidence in the debate on if libraries are agents of social change or followers of current trends. So which is it? Like with most things, the answer is nuanced and complex, but in the case of township libraries in South Africa in the 1980s, those organizations operated in a variety of ways that, to varying degrees, challenged social norms and helped push for change. Some of these ways were as simple as making the library a contested but shared space that the community could inscribe its own meaning onto, while other ways were direct resistance to pushes to maintain apartheid standards. A few quick points as to why I chose the sentences I did for most important, most interesting, and most frustrating. Most important seemed pretty obvious to me since this sentence gives us context to understand the title of the article and is echoed throughout the article. My pick for most interesting is this quote largely because it is an almost comical and extremity example of the perversion of organizations meant for the public good under a militarized state. And the most frustrating sentence for me was this one on page 700, because it's an eerie echo of the police violence that we're currently witnessing from around our own country. Here are the discussion questions that I have come up with for the student-led lecture this week. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my student-led lecture. I'm really looking forward to the discussions in the forum this week.